Thank everybody for coming. My name is Coach Williams. I will be your moderator today. Our presenter will be Coach Ryan Velez, and he will be talking about trapping the king in the ending. If you have any questions while Coach Velez is talking, you can message me in the chat, or we will take a break about halfway through, and you can use the raise hand button on the participants tab if you have a question. I think most of you guys know how to do this by now. So you can either message a chess moderator or click the raise hand button, and we'll call on people when we take a break. And with that, I will turn it over to Coach Velez.
Hello, everybody. I hope you're having a good summer so far. I am. In case some of you are wondering, this lesson was originally trapping the king with just the rook. But when I made the lesson, I actually included more than just the rook because it seemed like it would be okay to do. So we're going to look at a whole bunch of different ways that you can trap the king. Now, in this situation on the board currently, you can see that it looks like a king and rook checkmate. But that's not what we're going to cover today. I'm just look at that green line, and you'll notice that the black king is kind of stuck. He can't go off the back row to where the rook is watching because it would be check. And this is kind of what I mean by trapping the king. I basically mean using a piece or a couple of pieces to keep the king stuck on a certain part of the board so that you can do something elsewhere. There are a whole lot of reasons to trap the king, but we're going to look at three main ones today. Trapping the king helps pass pawns promote easier, because if the king can't do anything, then it's like you're playing with a piece extra because their king is stuck and yours wouldn't be. Slower pieces like knights and kings and pawns gain time to achieve a goal when the king is stuck, the opponent's king is stuck. And then lastly, if you have enough pieces, you can actually just checkmate if you can surround the king. So let's start with king trapping with two knights. Okay, so on the left side, you can see that the pawn has a clear path to go become a queen. And the knight with the blue circle is covering the the two other blue circles, and the knight with the green circle is covering the green circles. So what you can see is the black king is kind of stuck between these two squares. Like he can just go back and forth, and that's all he can do. And then all that white has to do to win the game is move their pawn down the board and go make a queen. Or actually a rook would work too, because the king is stuck. See, all he can do is go back and forth, and you could make a queen or a rook, and both would lead to a checkmate. And so since the king was trapped, he had no way to stop the pawn. So let's look at the next example. This one looks a little more complicated, but essentially it's the same thing. Again, we have this B pawn over here who wants to move down the board and become a rook or a queen and checkmate. And the bishop and the knight combined in this little pattern traps the king along basically two different edges of the board. So again, just for fun, let's look at what that might look like. So here, if we got a rook, you could move there, and then it would be checkmate because the rook guards down this way, and the bishop guards the rook, and the rook also guards these little flight squares. And lastly, the knight guards this one right here. So the king cannot actually escape this way because the knight is looking. So if you wanted, I could actually use the color coding system like this, and then we'll make these red squares the rook. So the king is basically checkmated. Oh, I should have one more red square. He's checkmated like this. So that's one way. You could also do the same thing if you got a queen. It would be the same thing like this, and then the queen would come there. So again, trapping the king on the edge means that he can't really escape to go do anything to stop the pawn. Again, we'll look at two bishops. It's the same thing. Two bishops side by side kind of have this sweeping pattern. You could even look at it, in an arrow format, kind of like this. whereas the king can only move to these two squares back and forth. So we go down. And see, I can't even move the king like this if I want to. All of these squares are attacked by the bishops. And he goes back and forth. And then you can get a queen. And then again, this is checkmate because the bishops cover these three squares and the queen covers these three squares. So we will look at the king with a pawn and a knight. Again, this should look really familiar to the bishop and the knight. You can see, or actually I should have said the knight and the knight actually. Looks a little more similar to that one. So basically, you see these three squares that the knights are attacking. If we go over to the pawn and the knight, it's kind of the same thing, just with a knight and a pawn instead of two knights. And again, I'm not trying to be boring. I just want you all to see that there's tons and tons and tons of combinations of ways that you can trap a king on an edge of a board. I'm not even showing you all of them. I'm just showing you a bunch of examples so that you can see how to do it. Here's another example. So if I go back to this one and then I go back to knight and knight, you can see it's the same squares in the knight and knight pattern, in the pawn and knight pattern, and the king and bishop pattern. It's the same. It's really just attacking these squares and then you're moving this pawn down. I have one more example to show you after this, just so that you have the hang of attacking and freezing the king like this. This one's a little different though, because in this situation, it's just 3 pawns, but this is good enough to win the game. Because for example, actually I'll use my circles. So this pawn is attacking these 2 squares, and the f6 pawn is attacking these 2 squares. So it kind of makes like this little wall that the king must stay behind. However, the king could technically escape like this and try to go stop the pawn. However, and as you all will know, this is the square of the pawn. We've learned about that before, but because this king can get inside of it or on the edge, he can stop that pawn. Unfortunately, these pawns can still move. So if I bring this pawn like this, he's going to make a queen. So the black king actually cannot stop this pawn and those pawns at the same time. So it's kind of like he's still stuck. So he could come back to keep an eye on the f pawn and the g pawn, but then this pawn goes forward. And so therefore that also works. Even though it doesn't completely lock the king in, the threat to create a queen is what keeps the black king stuck. And so that works too. So let's look at a big old checkmate trap. This one's kind of neat. Again, I've color-coded the pieces a little bit so you can see how they're helping out. So we'll start with the pawn. The red circle, where the pawn is, attacks the g7 square. The bishop, all the way back here on c2, is attacking this h7 square. And then the blue circle knight is attacking f7, and the yellow circle knight is attacking f8. And so you can kind of see, if I remove this pawn from, or this circle from the red pawn, you'll see it's the same pattern as before, okay? Except this time we have 4 different pieces covering 4 different squares. So sometimes you have to have a whole lot of teamwork. So in this situation, we actually do not need to go promote our pawn because we have enough pieces we can win the game. So here's what that would look like. It's a little complicated, but it's kind of fun to look at. So the bishop comes up to here. You'll notice that before, this knight is covering the f7 square, but once that bishop moves, the bishop is covering it. So that frees up this knight to make moves. So the king moves to the corner, and you'll notice that the yellow knight, his job is no longer important right now because the king is not threatening to move to the f8 square. So we check him, he runs back, and we retreat our bishop. Again, our yellow square knight is now important again because he's got to keep watching that square. And then the king moves to the edge, and then checkmate. And that looks kind of complicated, but we'll break that down. So first of all, this knight that just moved is attacking the king and the G8 square where he could move to. So those two squares are covered. So I'll do that with yellow. Kind of hard to see, but that's okay. Now this knight is attacking the H8 square and defending the pawn on H4. So we can put two circles there and there. So the black king cannot move there. The pawn is attacking the G7 square. So we can put a red circle there for the pawn. And finally, the bishop right here is attacking this square. So since he's watching that square, it is checkmate because all the squares are covered. So sometimes you trap a king to promote a pawn. Sometimes you trap a king to get simply to get checkmate. Sometimes it's both. And then other times you trap the king for other reasons, which we're going to cover in a little while. But right now we will break for questions, and then I will give you all more detailed examples.
My question is there a way to trap a king with only one piece?
Yes, there is. The reason I didn't put it on this example is because if you have that one piece, you're basically just winning the game anyway. But here we go. There's actually two ways to do that. I'll go ahead and put a rook here like that too. Okay, so the first way is, of course, using a queen. She can attack these squares like this, and the king only has two squares to go to. So that's one way to do it, is with the queen. But let's say we wanted to not use the queen. Let me reorganize these pieces a little bit. So now we have a situation where the rook is trapping the king. The king has basically all of these squares. And the difference between the rook and the queen is that the rook does not guard diagonally. So if we go back to the queen, you can see that she guards diagonally and here. So that means the king can never approach the queen and go try to get her. He can't do that. But with the rook, theoretically he could like come down, and if this rook were like up here, so the rook is trapping, the king could move here and suddenly he's threatening the rook, so the rook would have to run away. So you can use one piece to trap the king on the edge of the board. The queen is the most efficient piece for doing that, but she can also lead to stalemate situations if you're not careful. So
Thank you.
you're welcome.
All right, Suhas, what is your question?
Can you show us the plate, like the board where you had like the 3-pawn checkmate?
This one?
Yeah. When the king tried to escape, couldn't the pawn on F6 move forward?
Yes. This is totally and completely fine. What would happen is the king would he's in check, of course, so he has to get out of check. And now if you make a queen, the king could just take it. And there's a neat little trick here I'll show you too. Let's say I move this pawn down the board. The king cannot safely take this pawn because then you would get a queen. And the king doesn't want you to get a queen. So instead of taking the pawn, the king will move back and forth.
I'm not drinking now.
See, this is all that could happen. Otherwise, you're going to get a queen. And so the problem is the king cannot stop all of the pawns. Like once you get this queen, he can take and suddenly he's in big trouble. Something like this might happen, and that's checkmate. So yeah, so you're correct that the F pawn could move, but the king, the king would not. He would not have to let that become a queen. The problem is actually still the B pawn. So, does that make sense, Suhas?
Yeah, thanks.
Excellent.
Is the 3 pawns example kind of like overloading a piece?
Yes, that's a good question. He said, is the 3 pawns example like overloading a piece? And the answer to that is yes. Okay, so for example, there's a tactic in chess called overloading a piece, and it is kind of like our theme where we're discussing trapping the king, because basically what overloading means is the king has, or any piece, has 2 jobs or more, And you can't do 2 jobs or more with 1 piece sometimes. Like right now, this king's job is stop these pawns and stop that pawn. Well, that really long arrow shows why this is not possible, because the king cannot be over here and over here at the same time. If the king had like a bishop or a rook or something helping, then he could stop all of these pawns. But since he's on his own, he can't. So the theme of the overloaded piece is similar to trapping the king. That is true. That was a good question.
All right, excellent.
All right. So the first example I'm going to show you is how to trap the king using a bishop. This game is a little more like an actual chess game and something that you might see versus, you know, the examples I've been showing you. Because the examples I've been showing you were just ones I set up, but this actually comes from a game that I played. I was playing white in this game, and I played bishop to here. And the idea is, by putting my bishop right here, it prevents this pawn from being able to move forward, because theoretically, the black king could move their pawn forward and then bring their king out like this and try to go stop this pawn over here. So that's what my opponent, I think, wanted to do, but I didn't allow that. So I played right here. So since he's in check, he has to get out of check. And you'll see that a combination of these pawns and my bishop kind of keeps his king a little stuck in one area of the board. Now, he does have a way out. He can try to come out this way, but I have an answer for that too. So I'm going to use my king. So watch what happens. I'm moving my pawn down the board, and then I bring my king right here. And using that color coding system that I showed you all, the bishop guards d8 and e7, and my king kind of fills in the gap right here by watching the d7 square. So that keeps the king out of the game. So it's kind of like this bishop is fighting against my king and pawn, and that's not a fair fight. The bishop can only do so much. So he does the best he can. He goes there, so that if I move my king up, he could take my pawn. So that would be bad for me. So I move this pawn forward, because the idea is eventually he either has to run away with his king or move his bishop back, both of which allow my king to help get out of the way of this pawn. And I'll show you why in a moment. So his king, or his bishop goes back. Now, he was also attacking this pawn like this. And there's no real reason for me to give him a pawn for free. So I move the pawn forward. He moves the bishop back, watching my pawn again. Again, that prevents me from like stepping out of the way to let the pawn go become a queen, because then he would take it. So his constant watching of that pawn is really important. So I play my pawn to h4. He goes to h6. I go to h5. He took and I took, and now we have a problem. If he moves his king away, then I can start moving my king this way and bringing my pawn down the board like that. Or if he moves his bishop away, I can move my king here, attacking his bishop like this. Actually, I guess I could just do the move. He actually chose king to f8, but let's look at the bishop move. So if he had actually gone there, then I could play like this. He would run away, and then my pawn would guard there. See, my bishop guards these two, and then my pawn would fill in that hole again. So that's kind of neat, keeping his king out, and he's kind of powerless to do much. But anyway, in the game, he actually had played king to f8 instead. So I brought my king over, which clears the path for this pawn. He checks me because he doesn't have a whole lot to do. And again, now here's a really cool thing. Now my king is guarding both of these squares, and my bishop is guarding this square. So my bishop was guarding this square, but since my king has taken over that job, that means this bishop can go somewhere else and do something different. So let's watch what happens with that. So he moves his bishop away. I move my pawn down the board. Again, he doesn't have a lot he can do. Now, I could move this pawn forward. And if I did that, he could sacrifice the bishop. And I would still win this game, but he's made it a lot harder on me because now I have to win 2 different pawns, and then I have to bring this pawn down the board, and then I have to get his king out of the corner. That's a lot of work. So I don't want to do that. So I play bishop check. So his king is forced to go away because my king was guarding this square. So it was kind of like this. Actually, if I go back, my king is guarding right there. So he can't really go towards my white pawn. He's got to run away. So then I block his bishop's view of this square. So he trades bishops, and then I can go get a queen. And this is basically where we ended up, the game ended up going, he ended up resigning because once I go there, I can bring my king in, and now he's just in big trouble. There's not a lot he can do. So, and then here I trap him on the edge, and I bring my king across and checkmate. So that was a long example of how you could use like a bishop to trap the king. The main idea was just this first position here, is I'm using his pawns and my bishop to kind of create a cage, and then I just look ahead and see that this is his way out of the cage, and so I have to bring my king down to cover that square so that he doesn't get out. So let's look at the next example. The next 2 examples involve rooks. So right here, this is a fairly even position. Essentially, if this king can get in front of my pawn, this game will be a draw. And it's very possible for him to do that. Unfortunately, I know about king trapping. So he starts bringing his king over, and then I move my rook, stopping his king. So now it's like a king and a pawn versus a rook, right? And so let's see how that goes. So he's just going to go, his king's coming down to attack my rook, because there's not a lot else that his rook can do other than sacrifice for the pawn. And if he does that, then I'll just win because I have a rook. So we move the king down. I'm bringing my pawn down. He's checking me a whole lot. And then I do this fancy move. So what has happened is I'm actually putting my king in a position directly in the way of his king. So once I start moving this pawn down the board, his king will have to like go all the way around, and that'll be too slow. He won't be able to catch my pawn. So now that my king is in the way, I can actually use my rook to go guard my pawn now. So I do that. He checks me, and now he has no more good checks, so he has to run away, and I move the pawn. And see, whenever he checks me, you will have learned about the different ways to get out of check. Like I could run away with my king, but in this position, it's better to move my pawn forward to get out of check because I want to move my pawn all the way down and go make a queen. So his king, you'll notice, is just way too far away to help. So everything is up to the rook. And then he checks me, and I block by promoting to a queen, and he takes. And of course, I can win with a king and a rook because I can do the king and rook checkmate. But the idea is, if you go all the way back, you'll notice all I had to do was block his king for a little while so that my king could basically come up the board like this and just kind of get in the way, and then I was able to move the pawn down the board with the help of the rook. So we'll quickly go through that just so you can see. The king gets in the way, the pawn just keeps moving down, and by the time my pawn was halfway down the board, his king was way too far away. So that's one example. And now we'll look at our final example. This one's kind of a neat one because white is winning by a whole lot. They've got lots of extra pawns, and they've got all these passed pawns. And the plan is we move the rook down to cut the king off on this blue arrow here. So the king is kind of cut off. He's not going to be able to come into the game very easily. And the pawns are going to move down the board. And we know to move the pawns down the board based on what black does. So watch this. He moves his pawn. No problem. Our pawns are going to need help of our king. So actually I should show that. We moved this pawn 2 squares to go down the board. He attacked it, and then we moved it again because by moving it again, it got to a square where the B pawn was defending it. So we just moved our pawn 2 squares closer, actually 3 squares closer to becoming a queen. So he's trying to do the same thing, but we go attack his pawns first. We're also threatening, like if he moves his pawn down, which is a bad move, we can check him and go take his rook. That's called a skewer. So we could do that too. So he can't let us get the rook, so he's got to move his rook down so that so he doesn't lose a rook. So then we take his pawns, and now we have a second problem for the king. We've got all these passed pawns over here, but we've also got this guy over here. So this king, he was stuck long enough for us to create problems, and now that he can move a little bit, it's already too late. So watch this. The pawn moves closer to its goal of queening, but in doing so, it also guards our rook. So that's a really cool move. So now we're moving these pawns down. Oh, since he's no longer attacking our rook, we move this pawn down. And he comes forward again, attacking the rook, and we move forward. Now again, this is trapping the king again. The king has to make a choice. If he goes down, he cannot go up anymore. So he would be trapped away. So any pawns that get into that line and pass it, the king can't help. And then if the king chooses to go here, which is what he did in the game, he cannot come down. He cannot come down here and attack because of the rook. So both ways he's kind of stuck. This isn't very good for black. So we move our pawn forward. And now this is a sneaky one because now he can take this pawn. But because our pawns are so powerful, we're going to make a queen now. And he takes, and then we have a kind of a neat little checkmate. I went ahead and put it on here to show you. So there we go. So we have this checkmate. I actually showed you that checkmate earlier. So, but the point is, at the very beginning, we cut this king off. Again, if that king isn't cut off and he's able to come, over here, he might actually be able to get in the way. But because we cut him off really early, he can't do that.
Is it possible for a king to trap a king?
For a king to trap a king? Yeah, a little bit. I'll show you an example. We'll clear the board. I have to put at least one pawn on the board. Actually, I have a funny example to show you. I'll do this. Okay. So here's a funny example. This king can move here, and the king can move down. And the idea is if my king gets to the corner, it's a draw because you can't get my king out of the way of your pawn, and so you're never going to make a queen. So the black king knows this, so he moves down so that I can't achieve that goal. So what happens is my king kind of sort of like attacks these squares, so it keeps your king from coming off of the edge. And so basically, a funny little king trap looks like this. And now it's a draw because it's black's turn and his pawn is moving this way, but the pawn can't move because his own king is in the way. And the king wants to move out to get out of the way of the pawn, but the white king is watching both of those squares. So this is an example of a king trapping a king. In a way, it's the closest I can do to trapping a king. The biggest problem with king trapping, I'll use another example, is my king can always try to move away like this, but then you can step back in the way. This is actually called opposition. So you can one king can never swoop around and stop me from moving on the sides like that, because a king doesn't do that. That'd be more like what a knight could maybe do a little bit. But so this actually looks like a crab king. I'm going to call this the crab king because he has like these giant blue crab pincher things for fun. But this is the closest you can do. Like my king can always move sideways, and you can watch these three squares like that. So that's two examples of how a king could trap a king on the edge of the board.
Okay, very good.
Okay, no problem. It's fun to play chess against better players because that's how you learn. Okay, let's see here. I'm going to do something a little offbeat. I'm going to go here, mostly because it's fun. Offbeat just means I'm not playing the opening moves that he's probably expecting me to play. Because a lot of times in chess, what happens is people play, they know the opening so well that if you take them out of it, they don't know what to do. So that's what I'm doing. So here he could pin me with his queen if he wanted to, but I'm going to move out of that pin. He did not pin me. Let's see. I'm going to move my king up to here, avoiding any complications with the pin. I think that would not be good. Okay, his pieces are starting to run into each other a little bit. Although he's going to bring his knight here and have 3 attackers on my pawn. That's his plan, I think.
Knight
So,
F5.
no. I'm going to play, let's see, sometimes you have to think. I kind of like knight e2, but it makes it awkward to defend my pawn. So I'm going to be simple about it, and I'm just going to play rook to here. I think preserving my center pawn is really important here. I don't want to give him a free pawn by accident, so I'm going to guard it. And that move is trying to prevent knight b3. Okay, so let's see here. Yep, I'm going to play knight b3 anyway. I don't actually hate this pawn structure because it gives me a lot of space to operate with. So he's moving there. I'm going to kick him out and say no. So he gets the e5 square, but I'm going to start moving this on the queen side in a minute. Let's see. So now I'll go here. That keeps his queen from coming into that square attacking my b pawn. And it gets my bishop into a really active spot. Okay, so now I'm going to bring my queen in because I really want him to either give me that pawn or defend it with a bad move or something like that. I think he's going to play rook over. Rook over is a good move. We'll see what he does. He retreats his knight. I did not think he would do that move. So let's see here. I can play. I'm going to bring my rook to the center because again I have all this space. I might as well use my space. Okay, so he's going there. I am not moving that piece. I could move forward almost. I can't quite get away with that. Let's see. It's always tough when you're playing somebody who's really good because you have no... Oh, I actually see kind of a neat idea. All right, I'm going to run away with my queen for a second. I think he's going to bring his knight in a moment. I'm not sure if he'll bring it there or e5. E5 is a support point. For those of you who remember what a support point is, it's a good spot for him to move, but he didn't do that. Interesting. Let's see. If I take his knight, then my pawns are going to be kind of in trouble a little bit, but I think that's okay. I'm okay with that. I think his pawns are not super happy themselves. So, okay. Oh, he took that way. I did not expect that. Interesting. I definitely did not expect him to do that. So I'm going to move my pawn forward. I'm pretty happy here. This is really good for me. I think he should have taken with the other pawn because he has no way to really attack my pawns. My pawns are kind of stuck, but yeah, so awesome. Okay. Yeah, I will take that. No problem there. And I'm going to go here. That guards this square, so his rook can't come in very easily. So my knight guards back here, my rook guards here. Oh, that's a good move by him, actually. That's good usefulness of his bishop. That's a good point. Well, I definitely don't want him coming to the second row, so I'm going to go here. That makes this pawn a little weak. So he could slide his rook back or right to... actually, yeah, he could just slide his rook over to here, and that's a good move for him, I think. Although he is giving me this pawn. And I think he just realized that. So what do we do? Well, we're going to move forward, because if you don't move these 2 pawns forward, I'm not sure what my plan is. I need to make sure that I'm staying active. So I'm going to go there. Oh, he did not take it. Probably because he didn't want to give me a pass pawn, and I understand that. That is a reasonable thing to not want me to have. So I am going to go here. That allows my bishop to go here and make some threats this way. I'm going to try to force him to give me a pass pawn or do something more useful for me. He's got a good position, though. I mean, his bishop is not very good, but this bishop's going to become good pretty soon, and his rook is on the only open file. So that's why I want to keep his rook out of these 3 squares, which I have successfully done so far. I don't really know what that does. He wants to come over here, I guess. I'm not really sure that's useful. Sure. So let's see here. I will go, let's see, I'm deciding if I'm going to take here. If I take with check, then I can follow up with this check, and that kind of develops my pieces a little bit against him. But he'll bring his king in. So I'm going to do that, because again, I have a very low time. So yeah, sometimes these talking games, you get in trouble. Oh, wait a minute. All right, I'm going to go here. He can check me, but I'm not sure check is a big deal. Yeah, it doesn't matter on its own. Let's see. Yeah, if I take that, he goes there. So no problem. No problem, team. Oh, that's interesting. I will definitely take that. I don't know why he just did that. I do not know why he just did that. I'll go here and threaten him. All right. I'll take with... yeah, I'll take with a pawn. Let's see what he does. I think he's going to move this pawn forward. That's what I would do. Now he'll take there. I will take this. I'm going to attack his pawn. I'm hoping he moves there. Oh, he didn't. He just gave me this pawn. He wants to come get this pawn down here. No problem. I get 2 pawns in activity this way. So I am pretty happy with that. Ah, I'm going to cut his king off. Haha! I did get to do 1. That's good. I'm going to bring this up. And I'm going to bring this up. He's going to try to get a queen in a second, but I'm going to have to stop him. So this stops him. Okay, no problem. I only have 10 seconds. So he'll win on time, but I'm actually winning on position, I think, because I have an extra pawn and my pieces are active. Although this is probably a draw. If we both had like a minute, it's probably a draw. But I have the advantage. But the disadvantage of talking, because I'm talking to people while playing, he's probably not doing that. But he's a really good player, I can tell. I think his only big mistake was not taking over here with that pawn. He took with his D pawn. That was bad. And you'll notice that all the pawns got traded off. He had 4 pawns over here. I only had 3, and we traded all of them off. That's why I have an extra pawn. So that's why he's not doing as well in this game right now. Okay, I'm going up. I think that was not a good move for him. Okay, you'll notice that he's cut my king off a little bit, but I've done the same to him as well. So he's got to go back and defend that pawn. Uh-oh. Will I win with 2 seconds? That would be funny. Nope, I will not win with 2 seconds. I might get a draw. Oh, I lost! I couldn't take his pawn in time. That was funny. All right, Mr. Moderator. I guess that will be it for today.
Indeed.
And then our next lesson is tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Is that right? With
Correct.
Coach Daniel, I think.
Yes, with Coach Daniel tomorrow at 2.
All right. So we'll see everybody tomorrow at 2.
Bye. Have a great day.